E te hui, whaia te mātauranga kia marama, kia whae take ngā mahi katoa. Tu maia, tu kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tatou ia, tatou katoa. For this gathering, seek knowledge for understanding, have purpose in all that you do, stand tall, be strong, let us show respect for each other. Kia ora. Welcome everyone, and welcome to this Discussing Tourism webinar. I'm Chris Roberts, Chief Executive of Tourism Industry Aotearoa, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today. Our Discussing Tourism focus today is, of course, what are the major political parties proposing for tourism? Of course, tourism doesn't usually feature that strongly in an election campaign, but the COVID-19 pandemic has been the biggest shock ever faced by our tourism industry and by other tourism industries around the world for that matter. So today we'll hear each of the political parties currently represented in Parliament is proposing to support tourism if they form part of the government following the 2020 election, which is coming up, of course. Now, the format today, each party representative will speak for 5 minutes and then answer questions at the end. We have asked them to stick strictly to that time. So you may hear a wee bell at the 4-minute mark, just indicating there's a minute to go. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please be mindful that we may not have time for our panel to answer all of the questions, but we certainly welcome your questions coming through to us. Joining us today, Honourable Eugenie Sage from the Green Party, Fletcher Tabuto from New Zealand First, Honourable Todd McClay from National, and Honourable Kelvin Davis from Labour, and we're also hoping to be joined by David Seymour from ACT. This webinar is scheduled to go for 45 minutes. It may run up to an hour depending on the number of questions. We've drawn the speaking order for today out of a hat. We were going to go firstly with David, but he's just running a little bit late. So I'll skip ahead to the next one drawn out of the hat, and would now like to introduce the Honourable Eugenie Sage from the Green Party to give her 5-minute introductory comments. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you for joining us today, really delighted to be here. So Eugenie Sage, Green MP, and have recognised the huge pressure that COVID has created for the tourism sector. And that is why the Green Party pushed really hard as part of the government's COVID response and recovery program that we should centre that around jobs for nature, and that be a key part of that. Because the jobs for nature with the 1.3 billion across 4 government agencies is enabling staff who've lost their jobs through COVID in tourism businesses in particular to actually use their skills working on pest and weed control, riparian planting, wild and conifer control. Was just up in the Matakitaki Valley in Nelson Lakes National Park last week, and their Murchison-based rafting company, Ultimate Descents, has lost a lot of clients through COVID, through schools cancelling their trips, and through loss of international visitors. But it means that the guides who would normally actually go overseas for another rafting guiding season there were working alongside the Department of Conservation to repair and restore huts in the backcountry, which wouldn't normally have been a priority for resources from the Department of Conservation because they're not as high use as those in the front country. So I think it is practical initiatives like Jobs for Nature responding to the very real need that the Green Party will continue if we get the privilege of being in government post-election. And working alongside the Honourable Kelvin Davis and his leadership as Tourism Minister, as Minister of Conservation, have been involved also in providing practical support in enabling the industry to respond to COVID. The waiving of the concession fees on conservation lands, 25 million as part of the $400 million recovery package for tourism was a key part of that. And think there that the Greens have demonstrated the real recognition that tourism is one of the key industries. It was our top export earner prior to COVID, and responding in a practical way to the much reduced opportunities. Also, Greens will continue to promote domestic tourism, because we know that in areas like Queenstown and parts of the South Island, Rotorua and the North Island, when we're out of alert level 3, when we're in 2 and 1, there is huge interest by New Zealanders in exploring our own backyard. So the opportunity that the announcement Minister Davis has made today with the regional events funding, the opportunity for regions to determine what sort of events they would like to have locally, because events are a strong way of encouraging New Zealanders to visit other parts of the country. We'll continue to promote increased investment in multimodal transport, greater investment in rail and public transport and cycleways, because we know the opportunities that things like the Central Otago Rail Trail have provided for tourism visitors, whether they're domestic or international, to provide benefits both for the local community and also an amazing experience for people. And getting out in nature sustains human well-being. So the opportunities that visiting natural areas have provided, we will continue to build on that. And a key initiative that both the Greens and the Labour Party supported and were able to deliver was the International Visitor Levy. Yes, it doesn't generate revenue at the moment, but that $35 per international visitor, except for those from Australia, is able to increase the investment in enabling international visitors to help care for the landscapes of places that they come to enjoy through the conservation projects like the Kakapo recovery program that the Levy revenue has helping fund, and also to ensure that we do much more strategic planning for tourism, because the Greens recognise that tourism does deliver benefits, but the whole ethos of manaakitanga and hospitality is based on locals enjoying visitors being present and not resenting them. So good planning, ensuring that we have good infrastructure, good transport, and that visitors don't overwhelm local places is really important. And some of that international visitor levy revenue is going to better planning in areas like Piopiotari, Milford Sound, and also ensuring that local authorities have good infrastructure. So it has to be a partnership between the sector, between central and local government. And the other final thing is continuing to invest, as we've done in government through the Te Aki Promise, in ensuring that visitors respect the culture, the places that they come to enjoy. And thinking upcoming summer, critical need will be to ensure that people think about, with New Zealanders camping, going out to visit areas, about ensuring that we keep places safe from fire. The recent fire in Twizel from a Primus being turned over means that this whole issue of the Te Aki Promise and respecting and being careful in the places that we visit is quite important. But recognise the major economic insecurity that's been caused by COVID, and have been heavily involved in providing some responses to that through Jobs for Nature and through working with Minister Davis with the Tourism Recovery Package. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Eugenie Sage from the Green Party. David Seymour is with us. Welcome, David, and if you're ready to go, we're now able to hear your 5-minute maximum introductory comments. Over to you, David Seymour from ACT. Okay, well, David was there, and I saw him as I was introducing him, but he's now suddenly just vanished. So we'll just we'll go ahead in our order, and I'm sure he's ready for us. Fletcher Tabuto from New Zealand First.
Thanks, Chris. How's the sound volume? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you fine.
Okay, so look, just acknowledge, take the opportunity to acknowledge everyone in the industry at the moment. You know, as someone who worked in the tourism industry here in Rotorua for years, can I extend my acknowledgement and my sympathies to those of you who are business owners and operators in the tourism industry right now. For the last week or so, I've made sure that my visits in the electorate have been to tourism operators so that I can get a deeper understanding of what the pressures are. And actually it's a mixed bag, and I'm sure that's true for all of you, depending on your product offering. The pivot to the domestic market has been enough to give security in terms of carrying on and keeping staff going. But, you know, we're asking what can we do in the future? Well, actually, a lot of the groundwork has been done with the current government, acknowledging Minister Davis, the wage subsidy scheme, the STAT funding and the like. It's made a difference for a lot of operators. So what we are seeing here is the people pivoting to the domestic market. And some of the operators here are enjoying amazing returns, especially after the first lockdown. And I suppose that brings me to my first point on what does the future look like, because uncertainty is probably the hardest component for all of us to deal with. We knew what returning out of a financial crisis might look like. We just carry on doing the work, and we knew eventually we'd come out of it. Unfortunately, with COVID, we don't know where the next hurdle actually is. But what we can do in the meantime, and what New Zealand First has committed to do, for example, is to make sure we're managing our borders better. And I think that's incredibly important, and that's why we finally had the military placed in our border control management situations. And I say that's important because we all saw what happened when Auckland was locked down at a higher level. Rotorua here, and I know the rest of the country, everyone just shut themselves away. It wasn't just Auckland that stopped coming south or going north into Northland. It was the rest of the country, and that was crippling for a lot of us. So our commitment to the industry is about confidence and making sure your domestic market and your attempts to deliver a redesigned offering to the domestic market is safe, and you can have confidence that your customers will actually be there, will be able to travel, will be able to move around the country. And I know that for many of our operators here in Rotorua, whether that was tourism or hospitality or the accommodation sector, would be able to carry on at a much lower capacity, waiting for those international tourists. And I suppose that brings me on to my next point. I think in terms of domestic tourism, we have to be able to say to you that we're aware of the need for that, the kind of regional disbursement. And we need to get your customers to your door. And that means giving your customers the opportunity. And New Zealand First has always said, for example, Air New Zealand needs to do more in terms of regional disbursement and giving New Zealanders an easier way to move around the country. But Eugenie Sage mentioned rail. PGF investment into rail, for example, down into the west coast, but across the North Island here, means the tourism proposition for the likes of Pounamu Pathways down on the west coast, the upgrade here in Rotorua of Whakarewarua Forest and our lakefront has meant the Provincial Growth Fund has laid a lot of foundation work that's not only good in the short term in terms of jobs, but it means across the country, and there's still more to do, which is my offering to you all today, is to say that good investment in sensible infrastructure, and not just businesses directly, means we have the opportunity to increase productivity, increase turnover, and grow your yield, ideally on either the same or lesser customer numbers, which probably brings me to my final point around sustainability and that commitment to net carbon zero, and making sure that our New Zealand brand stays strong in terms of the international context, so that we continue to have an offering for the international tourist when we know they will be coming back. Kia ora, Chris, thanks.
Thank you, Fletcher. And I'm confident this time we'll be right with David Seymour from the ACT Party. Over to you, David, for your 5 minutes address.
All right. Look, thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. And apologise, I've had some technical problems here. I'm not sure what's caused that. Look, I think when it comes to tourism, there's really only one issue at the moment, and that is, when do we get our way of life back? When will we be able again to have people moving in and out of New Zealand at something like the numbers that we've previously seen? And it's frankly a question of the government getting a lot smarter about its COVID response. So the narrative that we've been sold is, aren't we lucky? Haven't we done well? Having gone hard and gone early with our team of 5 million, et cetera, et cetera. I think the view that is probably a bit more realistic is that we reacted relatively late. The execution of the reaction has been quite ham-fisted at times, when some quite obvious things haven't been done. And actually, we had huge advantages, and that we're an island nation that COVID appears to have arrived in later than others, with a very cooperative population who were prepared to go home and put a teddy bear in the window for 5 weeks. If you accept that assessment or something like it as being about where we are, the question is, how do we get better so that we once again have a border that people and money can come through, but viruses cannot? And it's going to mean getting vastly smarter in terms of our contact tracing, in terms of our testing, and our isolation of people who do have a problem. So once you start asking those questions, you start saying, all right, winners compare themselves with winners, losers compare themselves with losers. We got to stop this ritual of doing victory laps and self-congratulation by comparing ourselves with the worst in the world. So what we hear from our government is, you're lucky you're not Melbourne, you're lucky you're not Sweden. We should be asking ourselves, why are we not Taiwan? And what have they done to be able to defeat COVID-19 with no lockdowns? Well, very simply, they managed to have a central epidemic response, command center, which is multidisciplinary, all parts of government, public and private sector. The siloization of this government's response has led to absurdities like a contact tracing app that just has not worked at all, while the private sector had better solutions. Government as a regulator and a maker of the rules, an enforcer of the rules, rather than trying to do everything itself. In Taiwan, you can do your isolation in an Airbnb. But if you break the rules, they'll whack you really hard. Here in New Zealand, government runs the isolation, but they don't follow the rules. That's the difference between government being a referee that's effective or a player that's ineffective. And you can imagine in Central Otago having packages where you can come and isolate for 2 weeks initially. Hopefully that'll get quicker. And then you can do whatever you like. Those are the kinds of opportunities that are out there that this government's totally inflexible with. Number 3, you've got to be risk weighted in your response. There are countries with COVID, there are countries without COVID, there are countries with good public health, countries with bad public health. We treat them all the same. I would be looking to open an air bridge with Taiwan, for instance, because fundamentally they don't have COVID and have good public health. But we are treating everyone the same, and that's a silly response. We got to use better technology. If we had invested in Bluetooth tracing 3 months ago, we mightn't have had this lockdown. The goal has to be for the next government to achieve elimination without further lockdowns. And finally, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, continuous improvement, comparing ourselves with the best. There's no good doing a little dance, doing victory laps. We've got to ask ourselves how we compare with people who are better. So in my view, we take those 5 steps. We learn predominantly from Taiwan, who are best in class. We make it an aim to be able to move people through the border, have a lot more partnership between the public and private sector, new initiatives that allow people to come and do new kinds of tourist initiatives, then I think we can do vastly better than we have to date. You know, it's not good enough to give AJ Hackett 10 million and say that's a response. It's not. And once you've dealt with the public health issues, then you can start dealing with some of the fiscal and regulatory issues. I think the government spent too much. The debt burden is going to be a real challenge for business in every sector going forward. I think the regulatory burden that we put on firms, whether it be the risk of personal grievances, the Resource Management Act restrictions on developing property, or the new costs that get put on businesses. I mean, some people say a new holiday is good for tourism. Well, not for international tourism. By 2022, it's just extra cost, time and a half for people serving international tourists who didn't even know it was a holiday here. So we've got to stop putting costs on business. If we do all those things, we can have a faster recovery with less debt and less tax. But for now, you know, we're just bobbling along. We don't have a real roadmap to recovery in terms of the public health response. And as a result, we don't really have answers about how we get our way of life back and how the wider economic recovery returns. So I feel like I've gone over my time, but Chris hasn't reappeared yet. So I'll see if I can't summon him.
Yes, you can. You can summon me just like that. Thank you, David.
Look at that.
Right, just keeping things trucking along, conscious of time. So next up, our penultimate speaker, the Honourable Todd McClay from National. Todd.
Chris, thanks very much. And can I start by thanking TIA for organising this today? A very different election campaign to be involved in, but I think so very different for your members. Can also start by recognising the work that you and TIA have done representing the industry. You know, COVID aside, have always been a very strong voice for tourism, the good things about tourism, and since COVID, we've needed you even more. I also want to join others and recognise the significant challenges everybody is facing in the tourism sector, and to know for them to know that we're working very hard to look for solutions for them for the now, the short term, the long term, because tourism still is viable in New Zealand. You know, one of the challenges that we face is certainty, or in this case, uncertainty. And as we came out of lockdown, you know, many businesses in New Zealand, almost every business, and particularly tourism businesses, faced great challenges because they had had debt piled upon them when the government chose to close the economy down. And they've struggled since then. The government solution has been, you know, forget international tourism. It may never come back. We've heard some of them say, I don't agree. But they've also said that domestic tourism is where we must pivot to, and that can be the solution. And I think we did see early signs that domestic tourism was helping. Certainly in my hometown, the area I've been the Member of Parliament for in Rotorua for the last 12 years, we saw a lot of people travelling from Auckland and spending money that they might otherwise be spending overseas. But the problem we have is that the government somehow, you know, has a hole in the border. They've let this virus back in, and Auckland closed down with great restriction. And so we went from a time when, you know, Rotorua businesses and businesses around the country were looking forward to brighter weekends of visitors coming from Auckland to spend money, to it stopping. And therein lies the challenge. For tourism still to be viable in New Zealand, we actually need to make sure that the border is secure, because we just can't afford to yo-yo in and out of restriction. Every time that happens, a business is put at risk, businesses close, and people lose their jobs. So tourism in New Zealand is still viable, but it needs a proper support, and it needs a plan, and not just funding to a select lucky few. Every business has the right to survive, and government money, which is being borrowed at the moment, should be spent fairly openly and transparently. We need a long-term plan more than ever, and not just budget-to-budget decision-making. And this is particularly the case around tourism-related infrastructure. We do need longer plans for the type of infrastructure we need, so that we can partner with local government and for the tourism sector itself to have a much greater say on where this funding for long-term infrastructure should be spent. I would recognise the government has spent lots of money. They're borrowing a lot to spend a lot of money, but actually it does just feel like they're spending it on things that are easy to do, rather than the things that are going to have a long-term benefit, not only to the tourism sector, but to society. The reason we need this, Chris, is we need to ensure that that social license for tourism remains, and it's not everywhere in New Zealand. You know, it's challenging that in Queenstown, before COVID, you have local people whose livelihoods depend upon tourism, don't like the effect that, you know, tourism is having upon the place that they choose to live. We need a timely response to the challenges faced by the whole industry, not just a government that does the easy things that grab headlines. And I use the example of the travel agents who from very early this year have been making the case that they need help and they need support, because they were the first industry in New Zealand to be hit by the effects of COVID. And what we also know is that, you know, it was only when there was sustained political, pressure brought to bear that a loose solution was found, but it is a short-term solution. Unfortunately, it won't hurt them in the long term. Chris, we need a responsible conversation about the return of international visitors and the opening of the border. Our businesses need to know that the government wants this to happen, and they are thinking about how it might happen and under what condition and when. And that's so these businesses actually can plan and go to their banks and talk about what the next few years may be. But if we don't have that responsible conversation, many more businesses will close that don't need to. We need a true partnership with the sector, central government, local government, and the businesses themselves, as was developed and continued to be developed by John Key under a national government. We just don't need working groups that come up with ideas with some involvement from the sector, but not enough involvement, and then the government announcing money, but not enough detail about how that will work. And then finally, we need National will announce its full tourism policy in the coming weeks. It will be a combination of addressing the current challenges plus some of the longer term plans that we need. But I too today want to make an announcement of support for trends of $5 million over 2 years. This is important because we need to send a signal to international visitors and international booking agents that New Zealand will be open for business. It's not just something that we need to talk about for the next year. Trends is important in sending signals and bringing people to New Zealand. And so that's a commitment, an early indication of some of the support that will come from our tourism policy when we announce it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Todd. And our final speaker before we move on to addressing some of the questions that have come in is Honourable Kelvin Davis from the Labour Party. Kelvin, you're still on mute, sorry.
Yeah. There had to be one of us, sorry. Chris, tēnā koe mō tō karakia hei tīmata tēnei huihunga. Thank you for your karakia to start things. Look, we know COVID's taken a heavy toll on the tourism sector and will likely continue to have an impact on tourism for years to come. And look, I understand the pressure tourism businesses are facing in this period of uncertainty. I can assure you that the Labour Party shares your concern, and in government, we've been working to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, particularly on employment. We're fortunate that the work undertaken between the sector and government prior to COVID-19 has put us in a good position to move forward. And I want to acknowledge Conservation Minister Eugenie Sage, who I've worked closely with in this portfolio, Visitor Levy, and as a member of the Tourism Recovery Ministers Group. In fact, one of the highlights of this term has been the partnership tourism and conservation portfolios have formed in so much of our work over the last 3 years. And I also want to acknowledge Undersecretary Tabito, who also sits on the Tourism Recovery Ministers Group and has also been involved with significant PGF investment announcements in tourism projects. But right from the early stages of the pandemic, we've been doing what it takes to cushion the blow and to support businesses and workers and position the economy for recovery. We mandated Tourism New Zealand to focus on the domestic market. Their Do Something New New Zealand campaign is funded from their $112 million budget and will be Tourism New Zealand's largest ever market investment, with rolling campaigns over 12 months. And on top of broad-based support like the wage subsidy, the government has also agreed to the $400 million tourism recovery package. And then that was designed to help protect key parts of the tourism system and to advance our vision for a sustainable, productive and inclusive tourism system. And you know, that package consists of $290 million for the STAT program, and that also includes dedicated financial support to 130 tourism businesses, 31 regional tourism organisations and 26 inbound tourism operators. There's the $50 million for regional events to stimulate the domestic visitor market. There's the $17 million for the Tourism Transitions Program, which has already provided support and advice to over 1,300 tourism businesses that have been impacted by COVID. There's the $10 million for digital capability to help tourism businesses to develop digital strategies and access digital tools and benefit from existing digital enablement initiatives. Then there's the $10 million for New Zealand Māori tourism, and that was used to support activities including training for young people and Māori tourism operators, businesses, and support and mentoring. There's the $25 million that Eugenie's mentioned to the Department of Conservation to offset the payment of tourism concession fees to DOC for the period from the 1st of March of 2020 through to June of next year. And of course, the Independent Tourism Futures Task Force, which is leading the thinking of the future of tourism and to advise the government on what changes we actually need to make to improve the tourism system. You know, the global pandemic has been devastating for our tourism industry, but we have no other choice than to treat this as an opportunity to rebuild our tourism sector to be better than it actually was before. And like other parties, our Labour Party manifesto is still to be released, and so I won't be making any tourism policy announcements today. However, I can assure you that Labour is committed to continuing to support the rebuild and restart of the tourism industry in the wake of COVID-19. Our $400 million package that lays the foundation for tourism to continue to be a key part of the New Zealand economy, but we know further investment will be required once border restrictions begin to lift, and we want that to be as soon as possible. But you know, border restrictions can only really occur when governments of both countries agree that it's safe to happen. So we'll continue to support domestic tourism while the borders are closed through the work of TNZ and through initiatives like the Regional Events Fund. And we'll continue to engage and work with the sector, and we'll continue to support the work of the Tourism Futures Task Force, and that will help rebuild our tourism sector so the future of the industry is sustainable, environmentally responsible, and of high value. So thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Calvin, and thank you to all five of our MPs who have joined us today. So now I'll turn to the questions, and we'll look to share these around everyone. And thank you everyone who's provided these questions. We've got plenty of time, so we'll see how we go, and I'll also look to see what other questions might be coming in. If I can go back to the Green Party, and I guess this is a question that is actually relates to your ministerial role, but I think it's still appropriate to ask. It's a question around DOC receiving $25 million out of the tourism recovery package to offset the payment of concession fees. The question was, why was that not just taken as a deficit on the DOC balance sheet whereas the amount of concession fees with no international tourists here that the industry is actually going to save through that measure is probably in the order of $5 to $10 million. So the benefit to the industry is $5 to $10 million, but it's portrayed as a $25 million support package because that $25 million has been given to DOC.
I thought I had answered it. I did type in an answer to, I think it was Michelle's question, but anyway, I'm answering it again. So if DOC had just reduced the revenue, it would have had to have cut jobs and cut quite valuable and vital conservation work, whether that was maintaining huts and tracks, working on threatened species. So you can't just put a deficit on the Crown accounts. It's actually got to come from somewhere. And it was the operators that were calling out for fees to be waived. The fee waiver started in March, goes right through till the end of June next year. And yes, with a decline in international visitors, some of those concession fees will be obviously much lower, but there are still domestic visitors, and as others have commented, there has been a pivot to domestic tourism, so operators aren't having to pay those fees. So it recognises that it's reducing the pressure on some of those businesses.
Thanks very much. Question for Fletcher Tabuto. You talked about regional dispersal. What's your view, what's New Zealand First view on cruise ships and perhaps bringing them back for domestic cruising initially, because we know that cruise does provide regional dispersal. Do you have a view on when and how cruising might be reintroduced to New Zealand?
It's actually a great question. It's an exciting question. And I've been personally working with a couple of individuals and a company who've been exploring this option. They were going to bring in a cruise ship and make sure it was safe, and then do the cruising around New Zealand and make sure it was only available for New Zealanders. So I'm highly receptive to the idea. I think it's a great idea, and as I say, I'm willing to try and help out anyone who wants to make that happen.
Thanks. Now a question for David Seymour. You did certainly talk a lot about the current issues as you see them and the current mistakes that might have been made and the lessons that might be learned from places like Taiwan. Looking beyond and presuming we emerge from COVID-19, what's your vision for the future of tourism in New Zealand? What do you want tourism to look like in New Zealand in the future?
Oh, I have no vision. I don't want it to look like anything in particular. That's not the job of a politician. It's the job of people who operate in the business. The job of government and a politician is to actually create a regulatory environment where entrepreneurs can create experiences, products and services that tourists actually want to consume at a price they can afford. If you're asking me for a vision, you're in much bigger trouble than you may have realized. And if you're asking the other politicians, you're totally screwed. But what we do need to do for the industry is make sure that the regulatory environment is sound, so that you can develop property without endless cost imposed on you by councils. That's a real problem for setting up businesses. That employment law is sound, that you can take a chance employing somebody, knowing that you're not going to get stuck with a PG that's going to cost you 10 grand because someone fell out with you. You need a fiscal strategy that is sound, because if you cannot actually guarantee that the government's not going to raise taxes, and that's very hard to guarantee when they've just borrowed 140 billion, then it's difficult to invest with confidence in your future. And you also need skills. We have an education system where 20% of the kids that go in there come out functionally enumerate and illiterate, and that puts real pressure on the skills available to employers, not to mention tertiary. So there's a whole lot of areas where, forget asking politicians for a vision. Let's just focus on getting the regulatory, fiscal, education environments right, so that there's actually some opportunity to run good businesses. But of course, frankly, all of that is completely secondary if you can't actually get tourists through the border, which is why I think for the next 2 years, there's really only one issue.
Thank you, David. Todd McClay from National. I won't ask you about vision, but actually about a plan. And without, you may have some things you want to say for your actual policy announcement, but what would National's plan be for businesses that are totally reliant on international customers and aren't able to pivot to the domestic market?
Well, thanks very much, Chris. Therein lies the challenge of the problem of the long litany list of funding announcements that the current government has made, that actually it's applying funds to businesses that do have a greater ability to pivot or to survive or to continue around domestic tourism, and nowhere near enough, if anything, has been done for those businesses that face a challenge. So look, it's a very, very difficult issue. Some of the things we're starting to explore is how we can help these businesses survive and meet some of their costs until such a time as it's a degree of business as usual. So if a company is, solely reliant upon international visitors and there aren't any here, then actually you would argue that it doesn't have a future. But we do know that there is a time in the future where those visitors will come back. We need those businesses still to be here. I mean, just think about inbound tour operators as an example. The government has provided some money there, but actually it was so very slow to come. We're heavily reliant upon them because, they do more promotion of New Zealand than probably the government does. The final point I'd make here, though, is actually before we jump ahead to, where we should apply the money and exactly what part of the sector needs what, I agree with David Seymour. If we don't have that discussion about how we find ways to safely open the border again and start talking about that, then actually most of these businesses are likely to give up. Their banks certainly won't stand beside them. It's really, really concerning that whilst the Prime Minister announces that, there's a government guarantee of 80% of loans for businesses, including tourism businesses, so very few of them can get that money because the banks themselves say there's uncertainty. We don't know when the border might be open or when visitors will come back, so we won't even lend the 20%. They see that as too much risk. So we need to make sure the government has got the border secure. We need that robust, responsible discussion about how we can start opening New Zealand up again safely. And if Singapore is able to say they want New Zealanders to come back as visitors, well, then we should be saying, why can people from Singapore not also be coming here? We need to start that discussion rather than only be talking about a government that has to borrow money to give out to people because they don't have a clear plan.
Thanks, Todd. And Kelvin Davis from Labor. You did refer to the STAP program, and we're well aware in the industry that there's a range of views on how successful that particular program is. Post-election, as part of a new government, would that program be revisited in terms of any money that may not actually end up being allocated from it? Could there be a STAP version 2? I mean, any thoughts at this stage on what happens post-election related to the STAP program?
Yeah, and again, that's a good question. As you know, that the first year is basically grants, and then if businesses decide that they need to take up the loan, that they can, but not all businesses will. So there will be an opportunity to relook at any any funds that haven't been taken up. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, but we have to wait to see what business decisions those recipients of the STAP fund make with the funding they've received. Look, I just want to take up a couple of other points that the others have raised. Of course, we're looking to open the borders as soon as possible, but like I said when in my opening comments, that all depends when governments from both sides decide that it's safe to do so. As I've said in the past, it's like having a driveway with a gate on either end of the border, and just because we might be ready to open our borders doesn't mean to say the country at the other end is able to open their gate. But Todd, to be honest, they're the party that said that they wanted to open the borders as soon as possible. Then they said they wanted international students to come in, and that universities would be responsible for looking after those students, and now they're saying that we need to be tougher on the borders. Look, you know, I think that that New Zealand has, when David says that New Zealand needs to look at who are the best in the world, I think we're right up there with the best in the world in the way we've managed COVID. And so we, you know, others are looking to us for what we have done. It doesn't mean that we can do things differently and better. Of course, you know, there's lessons we can learn. But I think that if you ask around the world as to who is the exemplar for how COVID has been managed, people will look to New Zealand.
Thank you. Before I roll through everyone again, I'll just give Todd a brief response as he was specifically referenced by Calvin.
Well, the problem with all the self-congratulation is while you're doing that, Calvin, people are losing their businesses and they're losing their jobs. And I'm sorry, that's not the information that's coming from the sector. Quite honestly, when we said we want to see visitors come back to New Zealand, students come back to New Zealand, we said when it can be done safely. But I've questioned you in committee and I've questioned you in the House, and you've said it would be dangerous for them to come back. And it sounds to the sector as if you won't enter into that conversation or that discussion at all. Look, Singapore has said they want New Zealanders to come back. Taiwan is looking at it. South Korea has done a great job. What the tourism sector wants is a signal from the government that you're open to this and you will start the conversation, not just it's too hard. And by the way, if the government hadn't stuffed up the border so that Auckland went into lockdown, we could well still be talking about whether or not we could have opened the border, had a bubble with the Cook Islands, or whether there are opportunities to open up the Trans-Tasman border to some parts of Australia. Sadly, we can't have that today because this government stuffed the border up.
Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes left. We can keep going, and I'll divert off to a slightly different aspect now. If I can go back to Eugenie Sage. In your view, do we have the conservation tourism interface right at the moment? And if not, what can we do to make it a win-win for conservation and for tourism?
Kia ora. I'd just like to respond to the Honourable Todd McClay. That's another example of the negativity of the National Party always criticising. There is no playbook about how we manage COVID. This government has invested a huge amount in ensuring that we only have had the less than 25 deaths in New Zealand. That is too many. But we are putting every effort into keeping New Zealand safe so that we can have a fully functioning economy again as fast as possible. In terms of conservation and tourism, I think under this government, there is, as Kelvin Davis mentioned, there has been a lot of work with the tourism section in MB, with the tourism sector and with conservation to ensure that we've got a much greater sustainability commitment at the heart of our tourism strategy. And I utterly reject David Seymour's comments that our government shouldn't have a vision. It has got to have a good strategy to actually guide where investment goes and the types of policies and programs that can help the industry to thrive. And in conservation, we've been doing that by being more strategic, recognising that we need to invest in infrastructure, and also through, and this is an area where more work needs to be done in terms of park management plans, so that things like natural quiet are protected to protect the quality of the experience as well. So with the sustainability strategy that's part of the tourism strategy, and with DOC's new heritage and visitor strategy about protect, connect and thrive, that's the basis for a much better partnership.
Thank you. Fletcher Tabito from New Zealand First. What's your view on the vexed issue that even with international visitors in the country never quite leaves us in the tourism industry, freedom camping? Do we have that setting right for freedom camping? Is there more that needs to be done to address that issue? It may seem a very specific issue to raise here, but we still know from all the information we see that it remains a industry concern and a public concern.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, I've got several answers in front of me on my desk for consideration. All I can do at this stage is acknowledge the ongoing frustration. We haven't fixed the problem, and in terms of some of the solutions, with like talking to some of the holiday park owners here in Rotorua, we seem to have gone too far in one direction in terms of setting up almost competition to privately run firms. So there's a balance that needs to be struck, and all I can say at this stage is I agree and am literally working on it right now.
Chris, can I jump in there?
Sure.
Look, when I became the minister in 2017, freedom camping was probably the #1 issue. We were getting complaints left, right and centre. To be fair to the previous government, they were fantastic at marketing New Zealand as a destination, but the management of New Zealand as a destination left a lot to be desired, and we were in danger of losing our social licence because of the perceived over-tourism. We established the Responsible Camping Working Group, which was a partnership between government, local government and the industry. And to cut a long story short, the numbers of complaints have been reduced significantly, to the point where Jim Bolt wrote to me this year and he said previous years he was getting 10 to 15 complaints a day through December and January. And in December and January just passed, he had received just one complaint about freedom camping. We've invested $16.5 million into it. We've had camping ambassadors educating people. There's been app development so that people can see where there are parks that are full and they can actually detour before they need to travel, numbers of kilometres to get somewhere. So there's been a lot of work being done, and that's the government being an actor and a participant in working alongside the sector and making positive differences and positive change. If you were to ask me what's my vision for tourism in the future, it's to make sure that tourism gives and contributes more to New Zealand than what it takes. And, that's really where we're heading. And yeah, we do have to create the regulatory system to make sure that does happen. But, we shouldn't just sit back and let things work themselves out, because that's what happened previously, and we were at risk of losing our social license.
Thank you, Calvin. David Seymour, business events, not always recognised, but they're a critical part of the overall tourism and visitor ecosystem, especially that happens during the week, supports regional disbursement. Note that Singapore, in one of our questions that has come through, has noted that Singapore is now enabling business events to host up to 250 people at a time, including international attendees from pre-approved countries like New Zealand. What's your view on the current settings around mass gatherings, but specifically the ability for business to get on and do business in New Zealand?
It's a really good example of how the principles I outlined before could be used. Having a more integrated public and private sector response, having government setting clear rules of the game and enforcing them. These are the kinds of things that, if used properly, would allow business events to go ahead, because you could put in good rules around tracing. You could put in good rules around surface cleaning and all the other things that people are doing in order to make events safe. If I was to give a principle underlying it all, it would be that you can do things that are safe, not things the government deems to be essential. And at the moment, we've got this very top-down dictatorial approach of you can do that, you can't do this, even if you're prepared to innovate and achieve safety on your own terms. So, I look as the MP for Epsom, the ASB Showgrounds, probably the biggest and busiest event centre in the country. They're in serious trouble. They lost 2 million in the first weekend of this new lockdown. They have ways that they could operate safely. They're very prepared to sit down and have the conversation. Unfortunately, I've got to say, even when I've called the Prime Minister's office, we get no response from this government. And that is a very good example of the failure for government to collaborate with people who want to be creative, to solve problems in a way that's safe and keep their livelihoods afront. So, yep, business events are a perfect example of everything that's wrong with the current approach and everything that we would change if we were put in charge.
Thank you, David. Todd McClay, does national support opening the border to high value visitors who might isolate, say in a luxury lodge or some other means, rather than only using the self-isolation hotels. We know David supports those sort of initiatives, but what's National's position on that?
Well, I see that there are a number of countries around the world that we would perhaps model ourselves on that are doing this and doing it quite successfully. I think the conversation I was talking about earlier about how the border might open and the time frame and how it can be done safely, this can be part of that. There are high worth individuals around the world who would come and pay almost anything, I suppose, to be able to come and quarantine in New Zealand and then spend some time here, and it would be a boost for the tourism sector. So you've got to be very careful during election campaigns. I'm agreeing with David Seymour, probably a little bit too much at the moment, but actually, in my mind, what is essential is that people have jobs and they have their businesses and they get to pay their rents and their mortgages, and if things can be shown to be done safely, we should consider it. Because I'll tell you the one thing that has happened that the entire tourism sector should be outraged about is that the government said that they would look after our border securely, and we now, after 6 months, know that they weren't doing the testing at the border that they said they would. They weren't testing people in quarantine on day 3 to the degree that they said they would. And I've got to say, I think that's the reason why this discussion that we should be having responsibly about the time frame and under what condition for people to look to start returning to New Zealand, it feels almost impossible today.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. So we'll ask one final question of all our panelists. There's been quite a few questions, and we get this all the time of when might the border open? So I'm not going to ask that question because I think it's almost impossible to answer, unfortunately, at the moment. But an interesting take on that question is, when would you see tourism, or do you see tourism becoming New Zealand's top export earner again? And if yes, when might that be achieved? And if not, why not? And what is the place of tourism in our future economy? So just ponder on that. And if I can start with Kelvin Davis.
Yeah, of course it can become New Zealand's top export earner again. And I tell you what, it has been this government's response to COVID that is attractive to international visitors. They've seen how well we actually have done. It hasn't been perfect, we admit that. But because of the way we have dealt with it, the fact that we've had so few deaths and so few cases, there is a lot of interest from people overseas to come to New Zealand. There's any number of websites that will say that people have investigated New Zealand and asking how to get here and what's involved. So when our borders do reopen, we're going to be highly attractive to the rest of the world, and we just, as soon as our government and corresponding governments determine that it is safe, we'll be opening the borders as soon as we can. We were hoping. People were asking me back in May to speculate when the Trans-Tasman bubble would be open, and I refused to speculate because businesses would have gone out and made business decisions and hired staff or trained staff or whatever based on mere speculation. And I'm so glad that we resisted the urge to speculate, because to be honest, we were hoping that the border would be open now, but of course things around the world and here in New Zealand have meant that it hasn't happened. And if I had have speculated and it hadn't have occurred, when I said, then people would say that we've been giving mixed and confusing messages. So the answer to the question is yes, New Zealand tourism will definitely become New Zealand's biggest export earner again. It will happen very rapidly when the borders do reopen.
Thank you. Can I ask Todd McClay now to respond to that question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Yes, the answer is yes, it will, but it's not actually just going to happen by chance, and not just because the government one day decides to open the border, because the reason it became New Zealand's #1 export earner was there was a concerted plan and a real partnership between the John Key and Bill English government and the tourism sector. Go back, 12 years to when we formed government, and think about the animosity and the arguing and fighting within the sector itself, and the head knocking with government. Actually, John Key as Prime Minister said that he saw great vision and opportunity in tourism tourism for investment, but the creation of businesses and jobs, and that's why it happened. So it wasn't by chance, and it will be, New Zealand's #1 export again, and it also won't be by chance. I just want to challenge one thing that Calvin said, though. He said that, he wouldn't speculate earlier in the year about when the Trans-Tasman bubble may open because people would go and plan for that. Actually, businesses need certainty and they need to plan. We know during COVID-19, well, none of us are going to get the certainty that we want, but they need a government that's going to be open to the conversation, not just a no. And when Calvin says we need to reach agreement with other governments as to when the border could open under similar conditions, look, Calvin, there'll be a lot of governments around the world right now that are looking at what your government has done with this, with what's happened at Auckland, is going back to a form of lockdown, wondering whether they should be opening to us. So we need to get the border sorted out. We need to know how that virus got in so we can make sure it doesn't come in again. And we need a concerted plan to work with the sector and the sector more involved, not just working groups. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Todd. Can I ask David Seymour his view on tourism becoming New Zealand's top export earner again?
I think it will, because the fundamentals are just so good. I mean, good international reputation, some of the best land and real estate in the world, lovely people who wouldn't want to come here. So, it's a matter of time before people want to come to New Zealand. And I know, having lived overseas, people just rave about it. For a lot of people, it's the trip of a lifetime to come here. So there's lots of fundamentals for why tourism has, a great future in New Zealand. The question is when, and it will depend on, what the response is to COVID. And I think, people have heard and can make up their mind for themselves. One version is, look, it's all good and we've done a great job and, it's a bit hard, but things will happen sooner or later. I think it's frankly a fair paraphrase of the government side's view. The view that I take, and I think it's fair to say Todd's in the same sort of boat, is that actually we can't rest on our laurels. We're not doing that well once you allow for the natural advantages we've had. We need to get a lot smarter. That means learning from the best, being proactive, a lot smarter and more aggressive than we have been. Otherwise, it will be several years on the current track, and a lot of the current industry won't still exist to come back in that scenario. So I know it will, but it's a question of when. One way it could be in the next year or two. Another way, it'll be several years, and before there's a real recovery, the whole thing will have to rebuild, and frankly, it'll take a decade.
Thank you, David. Fletcher Tabuto, your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Everyone else seems to have a lot to say without saying anything. The truth is that this is one of the best industries around the world. It's one of the best industries in New Zealand. And for me personally, it's got the best people in it, and that's why it will become the #1 export earner in New Zealand again. And as soon as we get those borders open and do that safely, and no one can tell us when that's going to be, we will ride that trajectory once again.
Thank you. Always like a nice, concise answer. And finally, Eugenie Sage.
Kia ora koutou, and I've tried to answer some of the questions in writing, but sorry, couldn't get to all of them. It will certainly become a leading industry again. And I think the rush of Aucklanders to get down to Queenstown after Alert Level 3 highlighted people's desire to visit. And I think that will happen internationally. And that is why this government has focused so much through the tourism recovery programs that Minister Davis has led on encouraging businesses to retain key staff. That's why things like the Strategic Tourism Assets Program, enabling businesses to retain that intellectual property and that nous to be in a really good position to rebuild. That is why government has got the Tourism Futures Task Force to look at what are the challenges in a COVID world. Yes, the industry will rebuild to be one of our leading industries.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of our MPs for participating today. Thank you to everyone for their questions. And we had over 200 participants hold in there for a whole hour listening to politicians. So that's a pretty good sign that there was some value in this exercise. So thank you to everyone. And the recording of this webinar will be available on our website tomorrow. And for those who want some more of this, I believe Calvin and Todd will be on Checkpoint debating tourism this evening. So just to close now, ka whakarairia te tapu kia watia ai te ara kia turuki whakatahi ai kia turuki whakatahi ai Homie Huie Taiki. Restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Enriched, unified, maybe, and blessed. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, thank you.